Greetings, everyone. This is your brother, Marcus Sankofa Nix, and I'm delighted to be here for another empowering, impactful episode for our History Heals Talk series. Have a wonderful, lovely guest. And as I always say, I don't really want to consider the person who was with us today a guest. She's more of a family member, but just a few in-house things to put forth for those tuning in, connecting with us for this wonderful, fabulous episode today. This is the History Heals Talk series with our motto, Learn from the Past, Heal for the Future. I am the host, and for today, we'll be engaging with the topic and title at hand, Healing Through Collective Memory, Local History, and the Historic Roots of Black Education. For those who don't know, this platform is really devoted to being a restorative, supportive, therapeutic opportunity to connect. This is a community here, so we want to build community on this platform, and we want to explore mental health and wellness through the lens of African American history and culture, which is what History Heals Consulting is all about. So not only do we offer this platform here for engaging, thought-provoking content, discussion and conversation, but for those who need support in terms of workshops, groups, lectures, talks, so on and so forth, consulting, feel free to reach out to me, but I'll give my information towards the end because I definitely don't want to keep our conversation waiting. So for today, I'm excited and I'm very proud to be joined by a wonderful family member. Her name is Hilary Green, the Dr. Hilary Green. And I'm going to read her bio. And there's so many things that I can say. I'm going to read a condensed, shortened version, but even what I read does not fully, completely encapsulate all of the wonderful work that she's doing on campus, where she is at Davidson, and what she's doing in the greater community as a historian, as a scholar, as an author, as a prolific individual that's continuing to keep the stories of African Americans alive. So Dr. Hilary N. Green is the James B. Duke Professor of Africana Studies at Davidson College. She is the author of Educational Reconstruction, African American Schools in the Urban South, 1865 to 1890. And Unforgettable Sacrifice, How Black Communities Remembered the Civil War. She co-authored with Keith S. Herbert a NPS historic resource study on African American schools in the South, 1865-1900, and co-edited The Civil War in the summer of 2020. And I am delighted to also say that I first caught a glimpse of the fabulous work that she's doing by way of the podcast the podcast Seizing Freedom. Shout out to Dr. Kadada Williams. And I, got into that conversation and really fell in love with what Dr. Hilary Green had to say and what she had to offer there. I consider her my book writing mentor. I'm in the process of putting pen to paper and trying to author my first book. And she's been very instrumental and very helpful in helping me to put that in order. And I also would be remiss if I didn't say that Dr. Hilary Green, who is with us today, is a world-renowned traveler. Every time I see what she's doing online, every time I see her posts, I mean, she's traveling, and traveling is really important because that is another opportunity to learn, to educate yourself and whatnot. So I know her students love her. I know she is passionate and loves this work, and I have such profound respect for her, and I'm so glad that she was patient to be with us. We were trying to get things going for our platform, for our show today. It had some technical glitches, but she's still rocking with us today. Dr. Hilary Green, welcome aboard to the History Heals Talk series. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
It's an honor. It's such an honor. It's such an honor to be in conversation with you. I know you and I have had a number of conversations off air, and so I'm glad to be able to be in conversation with you on air to share with the public and to share with those tuning in some of what you and I have already been talking about here and there when I could catch up with you with your busy schedule and your travels. But for today, as I said before, we're going to be talking about the topic at hand: healing through collective memory, local history, and historic roots of Black education. And I think that is so important and that is so critical. And I know that your work, and I got your work here, so I'm not just reading your bio and talking about how great you are. I've definitely been a student of your work. This is one of your books here, Educational Reconstruction. I also am a fan of Heather Andrea Williams, a scholar as well, who I know you're very fond of also. But the question that I want to first start off with is, how did you get into this work as a teacher, as a scholar, as one who is very passionate, I would say, so it seems, in terms of preserving the stories and the legacy of African American communities and individuals and families? What were the building blocks to get you to this point? Speak to that for us, Dr. Green. Go ahead and shed some light on that.
The building blocks actually began in my own family, and it was sitting on the porches of my grandparents, my aunts, my great uncles, my parents who raised my brothers and I in the Boston, Massachusetts area. And every summer, putting us in the car and driving down to James Island, South Carolina, right outside of Charleston, or to South Central Pennsylvania. And it was hearing the stories of my family members going to museums, going to old plantations, and hearing a type of history that didn't include people that looked like me, or the community stories I heard all the time about the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, where my people came from. And it's that history and that absence of history that caused me to question what I was learning in schools. So I was always the student who was curious about the people who were missing. And when I would read passages in my textbooks that said African Americans did not succeed after the Civil War, and I'm like, no, my grandparents succeeded. My great grandparents succeeded. They were church members, they were deacons, they were community members. That's success. Go to museums and they talk about slavery in very basic terms. I'm like, these are people who have families, who had stories, who have a past, and they weren't there. So for me, those building blocks of what I heard on my family porches, what I heard in my communities, and what wasn't being presented in my textbooks, my school curriculum, the museums around me created this dissonance around what I was reading and what I was hearing in my community. And as I kept on going, I then developed the language and the tools to always ask the question, where am I in this text? Where are my people in this text? And if they're not there, how can I add their stories to these very gaping holes in this history?
Wow. Wow, that's powerful, Dr. Hilary. I gave a presentation a few weeks ago. Where June is Juneteenth. June 19th, and there's a lot of conversation that talk about that, especially now with it being a federally mandated holiday. Even though the Texans, many say, well, this is something that has been a tradition long time here in the state of Texas, but I think about when I gave that presentation, one of the individuals who was tuning in, it was a virtual one. We were talking about plantations. We were talking about really that exposure piece. And, history is when you engage with the past, especially confronting the plantations, and you look at the dwellings of the enslaved and those cabins, and you look at, all those things, it does bring forth a visceral response. It can shake you up, and some may have to even put themselves in a mental frame of mind to even, like, let me get myself together before I go into this experience. But I do think that confronting and engaging with that history is so important. I also think, Dr. Hilary, and this is what I also want to hear you speak to more as well, just to get your perspective. We talked about the success, why it's important for us to talk about the successes we have in our history and the victories. And part of what motivated me to go down the path of being a historian was to reframe some of these distorted narratives, these deficit narratives. Can you speak to us about, why is it important to show the successes? Why is it important to go beyond the victimization, to go beyond the gloom and doom, and to go beyond, the frequent accounts of us being done to us? But why is it important to show that success and that triumph and overcoming? What difference does that make from your standpoint?
One of the things that I always look at, and I measure success as individual, collective, and big, because people still had lives. They still got up every morning. They still had families. They still managed to find joy in spite of the conditions around them. So for me, what was that foundation of resilience? And I think it's because I came from very strong family members who their lives weren't always perfect, but they managed to always find a way to sing on Sunday morning. They found a way to make the best dress that they had with the limited materials that they had, how to tell the stories with pride of who we were as a community, what we did. So for me, one of the things I'd like to talk about, all of the fullness of people's lives, they experience setbacks, but that doesn't lead to survival and resilience. So what are those little ways to cope with this and to survive and to persist and to fight, but more importantly, to dream for a better tomorrow? And when we talk about dreaming and we talk about future look, then you can see where they find joy, where do they find happiness, and how do they persist, and how that we in the present can, despite the crazy news around us, despite all the attacks on African Americans, the heavy policing, we still have joy too. We still have individual successes and collective successes. But more importantly, we are preparing ourselves for a longer fight. And how do you do that? Is how do you train resilience in people going forward? So by getting the fullness of everyone's life, talking about not victimization, but full narratives. We're not victims. Sometimes we are victims to history, but that's not all the history. And so
Right.
for me, how do we go beyond that to talk about the setbacks, but how did they persist? How did they push forward? What motivated them to continue? And that's where I think the biggest thing, I want to tell full stories, not stereotypical histories of what Black life is supposed to be. And that is of a deficit. I want more, we're more than deficits. We are greater than that. And I think that's the history that is so empowering, because once you get the fullness of that history, then you can situate yourself and your present day setbacks, your individual small and large ones, and see yourself, well, I can move forward because people in the past pushed forward and they made it so I can be here too.
Absolutely. And so what I try to impart upon my students, and what I even try to keep in mind, is a notion of gratitude. Those that have come before us, them sacrificing and them laying their life down in many ways and going through many hardships so we can have the quality of life that we have today. And so when we talk about this overcoming, this triumph, and I'm so glad he talked about the fullness of their life, the range of their humanity. Now, the thing is, as human beings, we go through stuff. We go through real stuff. We go through grief. We go through breakups in our relationships. We go through violence. We go through all types of different things. And one of the things that I've found to be significant, and this is what I also want to hear you speak to, because I know just from studying your work and what you've been doing, this is right central to a lot of the work you've been doing. Traditions have always been critical to being a conduit and a means of keeping that spirit up to resist and keeping that spirit of community there. And so when we talk about, Dr. Hilary, commemoration and memorializing, and when we talk about reconciliation, and the role of memory, what is your research brought forth to you? You know, what would you say to that, and how has that really played a role in us continuing to push forward despite the barriers and the obstacles we've had to overcome?
One of the things that I really see in this is who is the kin keeper? Who's
Mm,
keeping the family history? Who's keeping kin? And I look at that because there's the family, biological family, but how many of you have aunties and uncles who are not your relatives, but they could tell you everything you need to know of where you are as a people?
mm,
And they don't have PhDs, but they sat on some porches and they
mm,
had that porch sit in where they were expected to listen, to hear, and to tell the next generations going forward. So, one of the things about doing this work on memory and reconciliation, I always look at it, who are the kin keepers and the people who know this history? And it's not the history that is contained in archives that were created violently to erase Black memory, erase Black past, erase the fullness of Black life, but to preserve a very much a white supremacist model. I'm not looking at just them. I'm looking at to the elders of the community. I'm looking at the
mm,
people who on college campuses were the janitors. They were the laundresses. In their communities, in their churches, they are the elders.
mm,
They need to be there. And at this table where you have shared authority, I am part of this community too, but I have to listen. I can bring my history expertise, but on this and reconciliation, it's also the elder of the community who has that expertise that shared his past. And all of us have to have a time to listen to one another, to hear one another, but to move forward together. And we have to put aside our egos. And so for
mm.
me,
Talk about it, Dr. Hilary. Talk about it.
that's the joy of it. But at the same time, undoing the violence of the intentional silencing and whitewashing of the past. So one of the things that I do in this conversation and why I just listen at times, I also understand of my capacity to find the documents that are buried, find people's family history. And one of the things I get a lot in doing my campus history work, but even doing my first book on when I looked at Richmond, Virginia and Mobile, Alabama, and I was looking at those Black communities there, and the white allies who helped with the creation and sustaining Black public schools, and to my work at Davidson College. If I have a community member ask, do you have any information about my specific family member? I go into my archive that I collected and I send them free copies.
Hmm.
I will make digital scans of them. Like, yes, I do. I have this information in here because in the backs of all my books in my index, I identify all African Americans by name and their institutions. So people can look to the back of the book
Hmm.
and ask for there. But also, too, my research, they know what's printed is only limited. So for me, if they reach out and ask, I'm like, well, yes, I do. This is what I have. But now going forward, if I find anything about their family member, I automatically have that relationship and I send that to them because I have access to ancestry.com. I have access to very expensive databases and newspapers and other things.
Yeah.
I had the time to travel and get these materials. But if a community member asks that we're trying to work through this difficult past together as a community, whether it's a college campus or through writing the book and my talks, I will share what I know as I'm hearing and listening to them because all they want to do is to be listened to and heard. And we have too many examples in our historic profession and in the academy and frankly, society that
Hmm.
has told Black history and memory does not matter. And
Yeah.
now it does. So what do we do
Yeah.
with it?
No, I think that is so right. We had a show recently. Shout out to Dr. Dennis Hussar Winkler, aka Dr. Dahl, who's been on our platform, and we talked about, Dr. Hilary, the importance of the elders and the roots of Black education from civilizations of long ago, civilizations of antiquity on the continent up until, segregation. The extended family and the extended community has always been vital. Not just those inside the classroom, but Big Mama, her telling the stories, or grandma, grandfather, aunt, uncles, and I remember even talking to my family members, down there in Louisiana, and because I have kinfolk that are from the deep South and also Chicago, different places, but just hearing about how everybody lived in close proximity. And many people were kin, whether they were blood kin or just community kin and neighbors. And they shared their resources and pooled their resources. And because of segregation, that a lot of that was a little bit easier. Now it's a different type of structure that we live amongst. But just having respect for those elders who have those oral accounts that might not be in the textbooks, but they've lived certain experiences, and they can be able to tell and share their experiences. And it's important to respect our elders. And our elders, of course, are not perfect. None of us are, but they do a lot of times have that history. But also our elders, I believe, we got to tell the story. We have to not be afraid or hesitant to share and tell the story. I know that there's trauma sometimes with these stories, and sometimes there's shame and different things. But when we tell the story, like you said, Dr. Hilary, we can get from that the resilience, the perseverance, the strength, the tenacity. And as I reflect on your book, one of the things that I loved when I read your book here was how you talked about, like it wasn't just an individual getting their education and then, all right, I'm out of here. I'm on to get the bag. I'm on to make my money and get my profession. No, the community. In fact, the community may have contributed and supported you to get your education. Yeah. So it's your duty and obligation to bring it back so others who didn't have an opportunity could also take part in that. So I think that's really, really important.
And I will add, it still is the responsibility. And I think about this all the time. Like communities invested themselves in the second, third, and fourth generation coming out of slavery and freedom. They knew as adults that they might not get an education, but they're going to make sure the next generations of children did as well. And I see that with my students in the classroom, even my experience with going through public school, K through 12, and then college and university. And even now as a professor, my parents come to my bookshelves all the time and pull up the latest book on my bookshelf on like the Combi book on the Harriet Tubman, or different books on all that she carried. They're like, you can get another book. Here you go. Because they're reading. It's like communal reading practices. What should I be reading to understand here? And we're sharing one another back and forth. And that's what I think is one of the things that it's important to have the role of the elders, but the community-based education. These weren't state-funded public schools. These were community schools that received state funding. And that, I think, is what's missing, and why we have some of the debates that we have now in education, because I'm talking about a bottom-up model, and what's been in the Black community has always been bottom-up, and a shared responsibility to give back, even if it was how to teach one another. Here's a book, here's resources, to everyone to be on the same level, versus a top-down model that the state wants to impose on everything.
So Dr. Hilary, I want you to stay right there. I want us to go in terms of, I mean, we see what's going on. We see almost every day another region, another area, another territory. These books are being blocked and banned. The erasure of history is taking place over here. We see 1619 Project not able to penetrate certain areas, or we see, DEI now being on attack. I mean, the erasure of history is real. I mean, there's even certain places, I'm sure you're aware too, Dr. Hilary, you can't even say certain terms and say certain things without potentially putting your job and your livelihood in harm's way. And so my question to you is, break it down. How can we use these lessons from the past? And I don't even want to say from the past completely, because I think in many ways we still can tap into these things. But how can we in 2024 use some of the lessons from the past and apply it to today? Because African Americans are no strangers to the policing of the circulation of ideas, and we know anti-literacy laws. We're not new to always having to be subversive in our approach to educate ourselves and become literate. But what are some of the things we can implore today? And you already kind of hit it on that a little bit, but go give us a little bit more, if you will.
One of the things that I think is I'm seeing a lot are African American homeschool parents.
Okay.
And one of the things that I see now in developing the alternate curriculum. So one of the things I see with the community-based education are the Freedmen schools and the Freedom schools on Saturday and Sunday, and communities taking that over. Like, you know what? You go through the week on Saturday or following church on Sunday. We're going to have another type of school. And it's going to be the community leaders leading that education. The small books that you can see in local community, the little libraries, the little Linden libraries. I always drop off Black history into those little libraries, into those books, and I always donate to the Goodwill in the Black communities, because I know those are where they need they can afford a quarter for a book instead of the $35. The other thing I really do, and I think that we can do today, is we are not helpless. And this is where the thing that I think is the biggest thing, and what I learned in my first book, and I'm learning this other book. If we didn't have Black education and the Black vision for education, we wouldn't have public schools today.
Okay.
If we didn't have African Americans keeping alive on their family porches the stories of Jim Crow, but also Civil War memory and what it was like to grow there, we wouldn't have the National Reconstruction National Park. We wouldn't have these oral histories to be on TV now, because now people want it. We couldn't, and then also too, we can't forget popular literature, Roots, Lemonade, all those other things. Black people are always finding a way to educate. We can't just rely on the schools and the state to do that. We have a history of them not being good partners. So instead, this is where that resilience comes in, and shows like this. We create our own future of what we believe. We set the terms. And that means we create new spaces to bring people into the table and to support one another's until the conditions change on the ground. But another thing we have to do is fight.
Okay.
I go to school board meetings. I look very carefully who I'm voting for school board. I ask the hard questions. I ask the questions for the parents who have children day to day in school and they don't have the time to go down. I'll be that advocate in that room. But I will also question their policies, and I will show up. We also have to show up too, even if you don't have a child in the school system. We have communities, our whole community. We are all kin. We need to fight for one another. So go to that collective fight and the push. And I think by learning from the past, we have to fight and be resilient for those third and fourth generations to come for us. And we need a dream, a better future for them. But we just don't rely on dreams. We fight for those dreams to happen in the future.
Wow. Facts. I gotta say, and Dr. Hilary, I mean, you've done the history and the research, and I'm a student of history. I've delved through some literature and things in my own right. I remember sitting on the couch and talking to some elders of the local community here where I am, and hearing the stories of how when schools desegregated, these principals and high status individuals in the Black community were demoted, or they lost their job completely, or they had to go to other neighboring counties in hopes of trying to maintain the work that they were doing. But it wasn't the same type of work, or it just didn't feel and seem right because it was different than those segregated colored schools. I do believe, not completely, but I do believe there has been some division and there has been some separation of our community. I think about where I am, for example. I'm here in Maryland, and I'm in Howard County, one of the 24 counties jurisdictions in Maryland, and I'm in a place called Columbia. And from doing my local history research, a lot of the Black settlements, the Black descendant communities, the Black enclaves, the people who were from those places told me whenever the new planned community came, a lot of those, and this was like in the 60s, mid to late 60s, a lot of those Black communities were separated because some migrated to the new place, and the church collection plate started to dwindle, and people weren't living next to each other as much as they were. And I know you have even your own local history accounts to take into place. So, that is something that I think about, is how we can still reclaim that sense of community. And I don't want to make it seem like we don't have it, but I think we could do better. I think we can definitely do better. But yeah, what would you say to that though, Dr. Hilary? What's your thoughts on that?
There are two things, and this is one of the things that I am very grateful for, because all of the stories I hear of this, why I wrote a book on Civil War memory as my next book coming in, because I wasn't hearing those port stories anymore. Those elders were dying out. There's other scholars like Crystal Sanders, whose book called A Forgotten Migration that's coming out at the end of the fall, talked about the other migration during segregation. If a school district, a state didn't have a professional school, a med school, a law school in a state, it had to educate African Americans out of state. So they're shipping off and educating people from the South in Michigan, Ohio, because they want to provide graduate professional education. And that other migration, those who came back and received their degrees, she heard about that from her own family. The histories around desegregation that are slowly coming into communities. There's now a cadre of Black scholars who are writing that history. So how do we write the history? How do we capture those oral histories before they're gone? And how do we get them into an archive? So one of the best things I started to talk to people now about is, before you pass away and you think about what you're going to give with your materials, who's getting your photographs? Who's getting your scrapbooks? Have you thought about donating it to your local library so it just doesn't disappear or break up into eBay and other places there?
Sure.
How are we going to keep this and preserve these archives?
Like a succession plan, a historic succession plan.
Exactly. The other is, this is where I think I really am concerned about the next generations, because we're so divided over not just like our communities. We don't live next to each other anymore. We live. What do you do? How do you build community when you don't know your neighbors? How do you build community when you have social media driving different things and people don't listen and talk to one another because they're in our devices? What is the plan to make sure that these histories don't die with the next elders? So I'm really thinking about, how do we preserve the African American storytelling? And I'm looking at festivals, I'm looking at family reunions, but also, can we do a recording booth there? How can we get different collections before they're gone? And cemeteries in particular, how can we get resources to preserve these cemeteries and preserve the final resting places of these people who created these cemeteries, so people had dignity in death? And having those cemeteries as the touchstone for future research.
Yeah.
But how do we preserve that if our communities, we're talking about diasporas of our various Black communities in this late 20th and early 21st century? So this is where me, the thinker, comes in. Like, how do I do this? But how then can I do this in my local? It seems big, but I can control my local community. So I look at, how can I get one class at a time of my students at Davidson? How can I get them to help community do the projects, since they don't have the time to do those projects? Absolutely. And what is the storage materials for future scholars and researchers to then, and families, to come back and get that material? And so I think it's being more conscious to think about, what is that expanded porch if it's digital?
Absolutely. Wow, that's really powerful. Yeah, I mean, I love the the out of the box thinking and strategizing that you're mentioning. And I think that's really important. I think we have to continue to do that. Um, Dr. Hilary, do us a favor and give those tuning in your contact information. If anybody, because I know you said already, you're willing to help and aid those that are in pursuit of family history, trying to make those connections and other things. Somebody might have a question about, hey, how do I, get some tidbits and some strategies on how to pass this on. What's your contact information for those who are tuning in with us?
Yes, the best way is through my email at Davidson College, which is hi, green like the color, at davidson.edu. And I think for me, email, it might take me a while to respond because I get a lot of emails in a day, but I always do that. And then also too, I'm on social media. I'm still on Twitter. I will not call it the other thing. And I post history on there all the time. And I get people reaching out through Twitter still to, I saw you do this, but also too, I give a lot of talks in the community and talk about the traveling that I do. And I always use the opportunity to talk to local communities about this history. And so for me, it's the community stories. It's
Yeah.
those conversations after the lecture that
Yeah.
help fuel ideas to talk about how do we have these practical conversations. It's the teacher institutes that I do for teachers in the summertime to
Yep.
how to teach education and reconstruction, how to talk about memory and memorialization, and not just through the eyes of Confederate monuments, but what I call the living monuments, the actual people who survived and are the elders of our community. They're the living monuments that we also need to preserve and listen to as well. So what do we do with that information and how do we get that in there? And what's the toolkits to preserve our own community past with a plan for preservation?
Wow, that's so powerful. So Dr. Hilary has given her information, and I'm looking. I'm so into the conversation. I'm seeing the juice dwindle. I'm very low. But let me say this. For those who wanted to connect with History Heals, you can go to and the work that we're doing, History Heals Consulting. You can go to the website, historyhealsconsulting.com. Of course, YouTube will have our episode here with Dr. Hilary Green and many of the others of the past, and we're going to have many more, so be on lookout for that. But we're on Instagram at History Heals, Facebook at History Heals, Twitter at history_heals, and then even on LinkedIn you can see what's happening as well too. Or Marcus Sankofa Nix, you could also go to Instagram and Facebook, and when you see, this is all a part of who I am, connected. So when you see me, you'll know that History Heals is a part of who I am, and I'm connected to the work. Dr. Joyce King said these words. She said, African American experiences serve as a pedagogical tool and an educational model, indispensable not only to heal the Black community, but also for the wellness of everyone in society. And I actually really believe that. I think what we've talked about in terms of memorializing and commemorating and some of these strategies, they are things that have impacted our community. But I think even beyond just our community, human to human connection, these are things that can bring us all together. I think even in your work here, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Hilary, but you talk about what allyship might look like. And I know that for some, that could be a fragile, delicate type of topic to deal with. And I understand. Yeah, I think that what I'm getting at is the ways we have pulled together as a community, Black folk, African Americans, amidst some really harsh realities. It can be inspirational to everyone. It can be empowering to everyone. And that's why I feel as though this history should not only be taught or should not only be learned by us, but everybody needs to know our story. Everybody needs to know, and so that's why I think that it's so unfortunate that there are efforts to minimize that. It looks like Brother Ja, I'm at like a 1%. I don't want it to shut down on us. So Brother Ja, you there?
I'm here, brother. I'm here.
Okay, yeah. So I just want to make sure it didn't cut off. I don't know if it's going to cut off or we can make it. I'm not sure how long we've been on thus far.
41 minutes. 41 minutes. Great show. You can just close it out at your convenience. I got you, brother.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
So I think this has been great, and Dr. Hilary, I think we definitely, whenever you get the time, we got to do a part 2 for sure.
Yes.
Just know, let me say this, Dr. Hilary, you're always welcome on this platform. Okay, so I wanted you to be on here, and I got much love for you. And when your book drops, you always got a home on here as well too. But before we close it out for today's session, for today's episode, was there anything else on your heart that you wanted to just press upon for the community or share with the community before we wrap it up and for today? Anything else you wanted to share with the family tuning in?
I just want to say history is not something to be feared. It's something to be learned from and inspired by. So continue to learn about the past. And if they're trying to hide it from you, ask why and for whom does this history serve that's not being taught.
Wow. That is, look, I got to write that. I got to remember that and write that down. That's powerful. That needs to be on a shirt. That's a post. That's powerful. Yeah, I think it is not anything to be feared. And I think we see a lot of anxiety. And I think it's a trauma response. I mean, when you look at not wanting to face the dissonance and the anxiety and the guilt and the fear. But I think when we confront, I think that can enable us to actually come closer together. But we got to do it in a way with care, I believe. And that's why I believe that we have to take a
Thank you.